American Meteorological Society's policy program is supported, in part, by a public-private partnership.
Historically, if you look at storms historically, not an individual storm, but over the course of time, it is actually storm surge that's accounting for the largest loss of life in a hurricane. Roughly 50.
Our second speaker today is Jamie Rhome. Jamie Rhome is the storm surge specialist and team lead at NOAA's National Hurricane Center. He also serves as a subject matter expert on storm surge and coastal inundation for the National Weather Service's Hurricane Program and is the NOAA representative for the Tri-Agency National Hurricane Program.
This talk's not about sea level rise. You had a wonderful talk that established sea level rise, and I'm not a sea level rise scientist. But what I can tell you that is, as the ocean rises, as the sea level rises, future storm surges will be worse. Think of sea level rise as a base, and if you elevate the base, you start from a new level when a hurricane comes in and strikes land. So I'll be talking to you today about more communication, messaging, and what the National Weather Service is doing both now and in the future to better communicate the risk associated with these high impact events. But first I need to sort of establish why this matters. Why has there been such an emphasis in storm surge and such an investment in storm surge over the last couple of years? Prior to about 5 years ago, everyone really thought it was wind and rainwater that were killing people. And more recent analysis suggests that historically, if you look at storms historically, not an individual storm, but over the course of time, that it's actually storm surge that's accounting for the largest loss of life in a hurricane. Roughly 50% of the lives lost historically are coming from storm surge. And if you combine that with the lives lost in rainwater or freshwater flooding or river flooding, 3/4 of the lives lost in hurricanes historically are coming from water, not wind. Yet when you hear hurricane, the first thing you think is wind. The first thing you ask is, which Saffir-Simpson scale is it, right? Saffir-Simpson is a wind scale. And so we've really got to shift the way people think about hurricanes and get people to understand these water hazards. And that's what this talk is about, is helping people to understand that it really is water that's killing people. What about the risk to the U.S.? This is hot off the presses. This was published about maybe a month ago. The National Hurricane Center just did this study where they looked at, for the first time ever, the national vulnerability from storm surge. Historically, we've done vulnerability on sort of a community by community or state by state or a county by county. For the first time ever, we stitched that together and did a national vulnerability, national analysis. And based off our work, 22 million people in the U.S. are vulnerable to storm surge or within arm's length of the ocean. That accounts to about 10,000 miles of evacuation routes being potentially inundated or cut off, 16 million housing parcels vulnerable to storm surge. And these are some screen captures of the map or the analysis looking at different parts of the country. And that was actually published in an AMS publication. It was put online for early release, and I believe it's going to be in the print version maybe in another month or so. But the other thing that's really important here, and this is the part of the talk where everybody sort of sits up and says, how many of you knew that the reason we evacuate in this country is because of storm surge? We evacuate in this nation because of storm surge. Our evacuation zones in this country are built on storm surge data, and then the determination of which one of those zones are executed is primarily a storm surge decision, with the exception of mobile homes or engineering places that are susceptible to wind. Evacuation decisions in this nation are based off storm surge. And the data that goes into developing the nation's evacuation zones are done by NOAA's National Weather Service. And I'm going to prove that to you here. These are the recently released New York evacuation zones, updated from the ones prior to Sandy. This is New York's, state of New York. This is their data. This is not anything NOAA does. So you can see their zones here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They went from 3, which were called A, B, C, to this 6, which gave them more granularity. Now I'm going to show you the data that NOAA provided them to create that. And then I'm going to bring the zones back, and I want you to pick out a place along the edges. Maybe you just pick out a place with your eye. You can see how well their evacuation zones line up against the data that NOAA provided. Look right here. It's almost a dead ringer. This is to prove to you that NOAA is providing the modeling and data to drive the nation's evacuation zones. And then when a storm comes and threatens this area, the type of decision support that we would be doing in a storm, be it from the National Hurricane Center or the local National Weather Service office, will be helping emergency managers, state and local officials figure out which one of those zones is vulnerable. And they have the clearance times. They have the transportation analysis. They have the behavioral analysis behind each one of those zones. So let's say, for example, zones 1 and 2 are vulnerable. They know how many people that is, how long it takes to clear that area, what their transportation issues are. So all of that is preset before a storm. It's an incredibly slick system. So I wanted to take a moment to sort of put this within context. What is NOAA doing within the realm of storm surge? It seems like storm surge pops up everywhere. It's in the news, probably people wanting to know what we're doing. Well, about 5 years ago, we sat down and did a comprehensive roadmap, meaning we took all of the different parts of the organization that were touching storm surge, put it in a blender, came all together, came up with an agency-wide roadmap. We're about 5 years into the roadmap. And I'm going to be focusing more today on the comms side or the communications side. Please know that and some of the modelers are in the room, that there's a robust and strong effort to improve the modeling capabilities. Basically, the roadmap is 3 legs: make the modeling capability better, communicate more clearly, make your products more targeted for your constituents, and communicate in ways that people can actually take action on. I'm not going to talk about the modeling part today. It's a bit out of scope for this talk, but I will talk about the communication part. And this slick map, this is the other part of the talk where everybody's like, I never thought of that. So this is the way we used to talk about storm surge. So 5, 6, 10 years ago, we would be presenting something to you that looked like this, looks like this. This is Southeast Louisiana. If you can't orient yourself, you can sort of see the risk reduction system or the levee system that encases the city. This is feet of water above NAVD 88. How many of you know what NAVD 88 is? How many of you know how high your house is above NAVD 88? So if I told you the forecast is for 10 feet above NAVD 88, would you be able to go look up the elevation of your house relative to this elusive NAVD 88 and compare them and see if you were vulnerable? Indeed, our polling showed that most people cannot, which takes us to this so-called inundation or depth analysis or depth mapping, which looks like this. There's a couple of things going on here. First and foremost, we clipped everything off the ocean. Why do you want people to look at things over the ocean? There's nobody living there. Why do you want to distract them with things like this? Secondly, we post-process the data. Now it's no longer feet above NAVD 88. It's feet above the ground. Okay, I stand 6 feet above the ground. If you tell me the water is going to be 6 feet high, it's clear, it's direct. It doesn't require anybody to do math, to be an expert. So this was the real thrust of the change that's happened over the last several years to sort of better help us communicate the threat. Now, when we went to design a graphic, so designing graphics for public consumption is the most humbling thing I've ever done as a scientist. Why? Because I see the world through a different lens than everybody else. And I'd like to design things that look attractive to me as a scientist. They're very complicated when I design them for myself. So we took a new approach. We started from the ground up and we used focus groups to go out and ask people, what do you think a map should look like? So we're talking emergency managers, TV meteorologists, our own National Weather Service staff, general public. We basically polled anyone who wanted to talk to us and asked basic questions like, what should the map background be? And you sort of think to yourself, well, that's kind of a silly question. But if you make a map background that's too complicated, you distract people. They get distracted with all these sorts of, oh, I didn't know there was a landfill there. It's serious. You can really distract people if the background is too complex. So you gotta figure out what sort of background to help people find themselves but not overwhelm them. What colors should you use? Should you use blue? Should you use multiple shades of blue? By the way, this was my favorite. This was the one I thought was going to win. It did terrible, which proves that I don't have the eye for it. Should you use multicolors? What's wrong with this graphic, by the way? Anybody know?
Green means okay.
Green means okay, which is not good. It also includes both the colors red and green. Why is that bad? Physical scientists are not designed to do this. The legend. What to put in the legend so that you don't confuse people. Can they find the legend? Do they know? Can they map the legend to the data? We actually use eye tracking to make sure that people, when they looked at the map, they went to the right place on the legend and got the corresponding information. So we really went to great lengths to go through resolution. We even looked at resolution. Physical scientists love the highest resolution you can possibly go, but the users found the high resolution version right here noisy. They couldn't discern it. It made them anxious. It hurt credibility. So we had to sort of back off on the resolution issue. So anyway, you can sort of get a sense that we iterated through all of this. This is a snapshot of all of the work we did, from interviews at the county level to working with our FEMA partners to booths and exhibits at trade events where our constituents go, surveys, 18 focus groups. I've never seen anything like that in my time in NOAA for a new product launch. 18 focus groups. Several years of dedicated work, and when it finally all shook out, this was the one which won. This was the version that most people liked. Now, not everyone loves it, but when you're trying to satisfy a diverse audience, you kind of come up with this middle ground, and this is it. This is not Sandy, by the way. This is a made-up storm I cooked up for demonstration purposes. And what's interesting about this, is there any technical language on this? Basically, if you're in one of those colors, something's wrong, something's bad. You're vulnerable. That's all it is to it. There's no datums. There's no NAVD 88. There's no sea level. There's no adding or subtracting tide. It's all there. We're no longer forcing our users to be scientists and experts at storm surge. They can focus on making good decisions and protecting themselves. This is another example in Charleston. The reason I use this one is because Charleston hasn't been affected in so long, people don't realize how vulnerable this area is. So this example is to do that. The other thing is, look how complex this flood pattern is. And imagine if you had to explain this to someone without a map. If you were given only words, and words alone, no graphics, and you had to explain this to a decision maker, it's virtually impossible to do, which was one of the challenges we were having prior to this map, is communicating this complex flood threat with words alone. It's virtually impossible to do, because I tried it for a couple of years. This is the infamous Southwest Florida. This is where it all started. This is where we prototyped it. Why? Because the clearance times here are some of the highest in the nation. This is one of the toughest places to evacuate in the country. I felt like if it could survive here, it could survive anywhere. I think clearance times are approaching 90 hours here, which are some of the worst in the country. And we had a real strong partnership with Lee County that we could sort of do some beta testing. Now, where the rubber meets the road is these pretty graphics and this slick presentation is all great, but does it really help society? These are the existing evacuation zones for Lee County. Remember I talked to you about we make the evacuation zones before. This is done by local and state emergency managers. NOAA provides the data. This is their evacuation zones. So when a hurricane comes, the fundamental question, the most important question during a hurricane, which one of these zones need to be evacuated. Get it? Before this, you had to be a storm surge expert, a vertical datum expert, a hydrodynamic expert, a tide expert to decipher this complex maze of information. I'm guessing after 10 minutes with you today, any one of you could tell me which one of those zones is vulnerable to storm surge if we put that data on top of it. Could you not? So imagine the emergency managers who've had experience with this data, who work with us year-round, who go to all of our training. Imagine how well equipped they could be to make better evacuation zones. And I've been in the trenches with emergency managers. And working at the Hurricane Center during a landfall is a pretty hot place to be. So I know what it's like for emergency managers. And it was taking them hours and days sometimes to struggle through this very, very complicated maze of data. If we can get them to make a good decision in an hour or two, you've freed up so much time for them to actually execute the evacuation, which means we might be able to make evacuations more efficient. But this isn't the whole story. That was launched last year experimentally for the first time during Hurricane Arthur. Did anybody see it? Last year during Hurricane Arthur, for the first time, that graphic was launched. It will go in its second year of experimental status this hurricane season. That's Weather Service policy, 2 years of experimental. If we're successful after that second year, it becomes operational. Now comes part B, which is a storm surge warning. We have a hurricane warning. How many of you have heard of a hurricane warning, right? That's issued for wind. How did we start this talk? People aren't dying from wind, they're dying from storm surge. Why don't we have a storm surge warning? Why don't we have a warning for the most hazardous part of a hurricane with respect to life and death? And this is where the Weather Service is going to introduce, for the first time ever, a dedicated storm surge watch warning system with all the formality of warnings that you're used to seeing, like flash flood warnings, tornado warnings, these sorts of things. It will be implemented in phases between this hurricane season and 2017. Phase 1 starts this year. Now, this is a nuanced execution or launch strategy, so I'm going to help you walk through it. A prototype graphic debuts this year. Now, you're probably thinking, why would you do that? Because we so desperately want our constituents to be involved in developing this. And if I hand you a graphic in February and tell you to comment on this when you're digging out of 3 feet of snow, we're not going to get good feedback. But if I hand you a prototype graphic during a hurricane and say, what do you think? We're going to get good feedback. That feedback then rolls back into the execution strategy such that you're involving everybody in the rollout and designing and implementation, which means you get better buy-in, which means you get better success. So this year is a prototype graphic. Think of it as a vector check. Think of it as transparency, however you want to think of it. It's us showing you what we think the storm surge watch warning will look like in real time so that we can get that input from all of our constituents. And then that feedback rolls into phase 2, which is 2016, which is the graphic plus our dissemination, how we're designing the dissemination system. So we're going to get that first vector check on the visual this hurricane season, the second vector check on the dissemination the following hurricane season, and then if hopefully I still have a job and we'll implement it operationally. Operational means final or permanent. Operationally in 2017. By that time, the graphic that we talked about earlier will have already been in operations, and so this journey comes to an end in 2017, at least with respect to the comms part. What does a storm surge watch warning mean? It's meant to highlight areas of life-threatening surge. It's not showing you everywhere that could get wet. That's the graphic that we talked about before. It's showing you the places that it could really, really be bad. Stated another way, I'll be doing briefings during a hurricane. At some point, someone will get frustrated with me and say, can you just tell me where the worst water is going to be? Yes, in that red area. That's the most direct way you can communicate. It's very simple, succinct, and clear. It's based off the probabilistic slosh that was accelerated based off the Sandy supplemental funding to put tide in there and other changes to make it better. The current criteria, which is subject to change based off this prototyping and evaluation phase, is 3 feet above ground level. Right about here. You don't want to be warning for all water because then the warning loses its thrust. If you're issuing warnings all the time, people just, You really want to reserve it for that once in a lifetime back-crushing event that really gets people's attention. Same lead times as existing hurricane warnings, which is 48 hours for the watch, 36 for the warning. And it complements the graphic I showed you before this. It's not a standalone. I mean, they're both standalones. They're not one or the other. Some people conflate them. They're two distinct products meant to communicate two different things. I haven't done anything remotely technical in years, so I need to give credit to the team at the Hurricane Center who does all of the really good work. I'm reduced to PowerPoint and Excel as my tools of the trade these days. So these are the folks, along with the modelers in the audience, that deserve all of the credit. So thank you again for letting me come up here and speak with you.